Net neutrality means that the government will, one day, control the internet. Wait a second, I can hear you saying, that sounds bad. But almost everyone you know says that net neutrality is good. Doesn't neutral mean that no one is picking winners and losers? That everyone is equal? Maybe according to the dictionary, but not according to the people behind the net neutrality movement. For them, neutral means the government regulates the internet like a public utility. And that means bureaucrats making key decisions about how the internet is run. And that's exactly what happened in 2015. The Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, under the Obama administration, came up with net neutrality rules and regulations and imposed them on consumers. No open hearings, they just did it. Here's what they said. Internet service providers, or ISPs, AT&T, Verizon, and other companies that lay the cable that goes to your house are basically monopolies, like your typical utility company. To prevent abuse of this position, net neutrality rules prohibited them from charging websites different prices no matter how much or how little bandwidth they use. But this is exactly the opposite of what utilities are allowed to do. Electricity providers, for instance, are allowed to create pricing tiers. The more you use, the higher the price goes. If you use significantly more power than your neighbor, you pay more for the privilege. Net neutrality forces ISPs to charge all users the same price no matter how much data they send through the internet. It's a bad idea. Here's why. The internet consists of a physical infrastructure of cable and phone lines that carry the data. We call it bandwidth. But of course, there's a limit to how much data it can carry. In 2014, just two companies, Netflix and Google, which owns YouTube, consume more than 52% of the total bandwidth of the entire internet. All those data-heavy movies and videos clog up the pipe. To combat this massive resource drain, the ISPs floated the idea of creating fast lanes, bandwidth that would be dedicated to the big users in exchange for higher usage rates. You use more, you pay more. Believe me, I'm no fan of ISPs, but shouldn't they be allowed to charge companies more if they use more bandwidth? Furthermore, if companies like Google and Netflix have to pay higher prices for more bandwidth, they'll be motivated to find new ways to push more data through the pipe. And creative startups would no doubt see a great business opportunity to do the same thing. End result, more efficient, faster internet. Consumers win. The big bandwidth users didn't see it this way. Instead, they lobbied for the new rules to prevent the ISPs from charging them differently than anyone else. Naturally, they want to pay as little as they can for bandwidth, so they mounted a big PR campaign to convince the public to back the new regulations. And it worked. How could it fail with a name like net neutrality? They argued that without regulations, a very small number of companies, the ISPs, would wield enormous censorship powers. Our free speech would be in jeopardy. Ironically, the only companies that have been censoring content are many of the same ones that want net neutrality. Google, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, the big users, companies that, coincidentally, had a very close relationship with the Obama administration. YouTube's parent Google had more than 427 meetings at the Obama White House during his presidency, a rate of more than one per week. All those visits apparently paid off. Following decades of exploding internet growth, the government suddenly interjected itself with a bunch of new rules to stop a non-existent threat. Those rules were rescinded in 2018 when the FCC rolled back the Obama-era regulation under the principle that innovation would be much more likely to happen if the government got out of the way. In other words, the FCC returned the internet to its pre-2015, pre-net neutrality state. Sounds like common sense, right? Just leave the internet alone and let tech do its thing. Unfair or bad faith practices by ISPs, should they occur, can be addressed by existing antitrust laws, as they always have. But all that followed the rollback decision was hysteria. Taking away hashtag net neutrality is the authoritarian dream, actor Mark Ruffalo intoned. Authoritarianism used to be when the government forced its will on the people. Now, according to Hollywood activists, it's when it doesn't. Or let's put it another way. If you want the current or any other administration to control the internet, you're for net neutrality. If you want the internet to remain free of government meddling, you're against it. I'm Jon Gabriel of Ricochet.com for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video. To help keep PragerU videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.
What's the difference between a liberal and a leftist? This question stumps most people because they think liberal and left are essentially the same. But they're not. In fact, liberalism and leftism have almost nothing in common. But the left has appropriated the word liberal so effectively, almost everyone, liberals, leftists, and conservatives, thinks they are synonymous. But they're not. Let me offer you 6 examples. 1. Race. This is probably the most obvious difference between liberal and left. The liberal position on race has always been A, the color of a person's skin is insignificant, and B, those who believe race is significant are racists. Meanwhile, the left believes the very opposite. To the left, it's the liberal attitude toward race. It's unimportant. That is racist. That's why the University of California officially lists the statement, there is only one race, the human race, as racist. And liberals have always been passionately committed to racial integration, while the left is increasingly committed to racial segregation, such as all black dormitories and separate black graduations at universities. 2. Capitalism. Liberals have always been pro-capitalism because liberals are committed to free enterprise and because they know capitalism is the only way to lift great numbers of people out of poverty. It is true that liberals want government to play a bigger role in the economy than conservatives do. But liberals never opposed capitalism, and they were never for socialism. Opposition to capitalism and advocacy of socialism are left-wing values. 3. Nationalism. Liberals believe in the nation-state, whether that nation is the United States, Brazil, or France. But because the left divides the world by class rather than by national identity, the left has always opposed nationalism. So, while liberals have always wanted to protect American sovereignty and borders, the left is for open borders. When the writers of Superman were liberals, Superman was a proud American whose very motto was truth, justice, and the American way. But that all changed a few years ago when left-wing writers took over the comic strip and had Superman renounce his American citizenship to be a citizen of the world. The left has contempt for nationalism, seeing it as the road to fascism. Better that we should all be citizens of the world in a world without borders. 4. View of America. Liberals have always venerated America. Watch American films from the 1930s through the 1950s, and you will be watching overtly patriotic, America-celebrating films, virtually all produced, directed, and acted by liberals. Liberals were quite aware of America's imperfections, but they agreed with Abraham Lincoln that America is the last best hope of Earth. The left, however, believes the left is the last best hope of Earth and regards America as racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, violent, and imperialistic. 5. Free speech. No one has been more committed than American liberals to the famous statement, I wholly disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. But the left is leading the first widespread suppression of free speech in modern American history, from the universities to the tech companies that govern the internet to almost every other institution and place of work. Of course, the left claims to only oppose hate speech, but putting aside the fact that the left deems hate speech anything it differs with, protecting what you or I might consider hate speech is the entire point of free speech. 6. Western civilization. Liberals have always championed and sought to protect Western civilization. Liberals celebrate the West's unique moral, philosophical, artistic, musical, and literary achievements, and have taught them at virtually every university. The most revered liberal in American political history, President Franklin Roosevelt, often cited the need to protect Western civilization and even Christian civilization. Yet when President Donald Trump spoke of the need to protect Western civilization in a speech in Warsaw, the left-wing media, also known as the mainstream media, denounced him. They argue that Western civilization is no better than any other, and that Western civilization is just a euphemism for white supremacy. So then, if liberalism and leftism are so different, why don't liberals oppose the left? In a nutshell, because they have been taught all their lives to fear the right. But as one of the best-known liberals in America, Harvard Law School professor Alan Dershowitz said, "As a liberal, as an American, and as a Jew, I far more fear the left than the right." Dear liberals, conservatives are not your enemy. The left is. I'm Dennis Prager. To help keep these videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.
Who is Dennis Prager? And why do so many people love him? As the producer of the Dennis Prager Radio Show and the co-founder and executive director of Prager University, I have given this second question a lot of thought. Here is my answer. Luck. Unadulterated. Good fortune. Or it could be this. Through his radio show, his writing, and now PragerU, he changes the way you live for the better. He makes you a better person, a better father, a better son, a better mother, a better daughter. Name another public figure who does that. So let's return to the first question. Who is Dennis Prager? Born in Brooklyn, New York on August 2nd, 1948, he is the second son of Max and Hilda Prager, two worldly Orthodox Jews. Max, a World War II vet, was an accountant, and Hilda, a nursing home administrator. Both were movie star handsome. In fact, if the stars had been differently aligned, Hilda could have been an actress. She had the looks and the personality. Speaking of stars, Dennis's sign is Leo, which makes you want to believe in astrology. It's one of those little ironies that Dennis barely spoke a word until he was almost 4, but of course, once he started, he never stopped. He didn't like school. To keep himself from being bored, he learned to spell backwards. He was the class clown. He was sent to the principal's office so often, the secretary named a chair after him. He did the minimum amount of homework. In his case, this meant 0. In a class of 110 high school students, he graduated number 82. But he was always scrupulously ethical and honest. Cheating was rampant at the religious school he attended. He mounted a campaign against it. You'd think everyone would hate him for that, but they didn't. He was too charming, too charismatic, too principled. No one could, no one can remain mad at Dennis for long. When he was a sophomore, Max and Hilda made a bold decision. The traditional parenting model clearly wasn't working, so they offered their second son a deal. He had to be at the Shabbat dinner table every Friday, but otherwise he was on his own. They gave him a modest allowance and set him loose. Manhattan became his playground. Classical music became his passion. That and all things Russian. He studied them both on his own. That same sophomore year, he met his lifelong friend, Joseph Telushkin. Their endless religious discussions eventually became a book, The 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism. Still the standard text for those who want to learn the basic principles of the faith. Remarkably, every book Dennis has written is still in print and still selling. At the time, though, the future didn't look promising. Dennis's grades were so bad that his only college option was Brooklyn College, simply because Brooklyn would take anybody. But it turned out to be the perfect choice. He won an essay contest. The prize was a scholarship to study abroad at Leeds College in England. While there, he was contacted by the Israeli government. They needed someone to smuggle Jewish artifacts into the Soviet Union and smuggle out names of those Jews who wanted to emigrate to Israel. It wasn't John le Carre dangerous, but real risk was involved. Dennis accepted the mission. When he returned to the U.S., he was asked by various Jewish groups to talk about his experience. He's been traveling 131 countries and counting and lecturing ever since. Now living in Los Angeles, his public speaking and deep involvement in Jewish life led to an offer to host a Sunday night radio show called Religion on the Line. Radio was the perfect medium for a non-stop thinker, non-stop talker with a theory on everything from baseball to Beethoven. That he had the perfect radio voice makes the whole thing seem part of a divine plan. The Sunday night radio show quickly became a Saturday and Sunday night show, which soon became a Monday through Friday show. Among Dennis's fans was Hollywood writer-director David Zucker, of Airplane and Naked Gun fame. He had the idea for a sketch comedy about Dennis's ideas about goodness, but he needed someone to work with Dennis on the script. I turned out to be that someone. Working on what became, for goodness sake, changed my life. 10 years later, I began producing Dennis's now nationally syndicated radio show. Dennis already had a large audience, but the goal has always been to make it larger and younger, because that's the future. It was from this thought that Prager University was born. An internet phenomenon, it has vastly expanded Dennis's reach both geographically and demographically. Over 300 videos from over 100 presenters, and over 1 billion views later, with an audience that is mostly under 35, PragerU has changed a lot of minds. But there are many we still need to get to, enough to change the country, maybe the world, for the better, one person at a time, 5 minutes at a time. Think about it. At age 70, Dennis's career is on the ascendant. Pure luck. I'm Alan Estrin for Prager University.
From the end of World War II, the United States and its Western European allies were involved in a nearly half-century-long titanic struggle with the Soviet Union, known as the Cold War. It was cold only in the sense that the Russians and Americans never came to direct blows, but it was certainly not cold for the Cubans, Koreans, Vietnamese, and others who got caught up in the communists' relentless drive to destabilize the free, democratic, capitalist world. There were, to be sure, many morally complex moments during this long struggle. But the Cold War was, at its core, as clear a conflict of good versus evil as World War II had been. Just like that war, the Cold War was a death match between the forces representing freedom and the forces representing totalitarianism. Because hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, died in it, the Cold War can, with good reason, be described as the Third World War. The instigator of this war was Joseph Stalin, the mass-murdering dictator of Russia and of the many non-Russian peoples he had incorporated into what was known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or Soviet Union for short. Stalin knew that his Soviet armed forces could not take on the might of the Free West. Instead, he decided to wage this fight through the use of proxies, and by a massive use of disinformation and misinformation. His initial prey was Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia and Latvia, as well as Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia. Stalin had troops in all these countries at the end of the war. Despite what he promised American President Franklin Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference, the Soviet leader had no intention of removing them, and gaining control over their governments proved to be quite easy. In March 1946, Winston Churchill famously declared that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. When Stalin threatened both Greece and Turkey, President Harry Truman finally had enough. The so-called Truman Doctrine was born. The United States and its allies would not permit any further expansion of the communist empire. The Cold War was on. For the next 5 decades and across 4 continents, Europe, Africa, Asia and South America, the US and the Soviet Union battled for influence, sometimes overtly, like in Korea and Vietnam, and sometimes covertly through their various spy agencies. But the moral lines of this battle never changed. The freedom of the West versus the communist tyranny of the Soviet East. There are, nonetheless, as there were even at the time, those who argue that the Cold War was an overreaction by the West, that the ambitions and strength of the Soviet bloc were greatly exaggerated, and that America, with its massive defence build-up, was just as responsible for the Cold War as was the Soviet Union. But this simply isn't true, as an immense amount of archival evidence from Russia, not available until after the Cold War ended, now proves. Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, stated Soviet intentions plainly in 1956. "We will bury you," he told the West. Nor would any amount of negotiation, détente as it was called then, have led to a just conclusion of the war. The American diplomat George Kennan rightly warned that short of becoming a communist country, there was nothing the United States could do to gain the Kremlin's trust. The Soviets could not be appeased, only contained. But even containment was an inadequate strategy. Yes, the Soviet Union could not have beaten the US in a head-to-head confrontation, but it didn't have to. Victory in the Cold War would have allowed it, through intimidation and subversion, to dominate the globe, making communism, rather than democracy and capitalism, the preeminent ideology. There were many times during the 5 decades of the war that it seemed like this would be the case. But thanks primarily to the strong leadership shown by Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II, the Cold War ended not with a bang, but a whimper. The Soviet Union was, at the close of the 1980s, to use historian Paul Johnson's description, a bewildered giant, economically bereft, militarily exhausted, no longer able or willing to enforce its will. Communism had failed in every possible way, economically, politically, morally. It had tried to create a utopia on Earth and instead created hell for all of the nations that came under its sway. Yes, the forces of liberty eventually won the Cold War, but this triumph offers little consolation to millions who died or suffered needlessly through no fault of their own for a never viable and now badly discredited cause. I'm Andrew Roberts for Prager University.
Rape, murder, war. They all have one thing in common. Men. Aggression, violence, ambition unchecked by conscience, all the stuff of toxic masculinity, right? And the solution is obvious. Make men less toxic. Make men less masculine. Make men more like women. But I'm here to tell you that that way of thinking is not only wrong, it's dangerous. Here's why. When you try to make men more like women, you don't get less toxic masculinity. You get more. Why? Because bad men don't become good when they stop being men. They become good when they stop being bad. Aggression, violence, and unbridled ambition can't be eliminated from the male psyche. They can only be harnessed. And when they are harnessed, they are tools for good, not for harm. The same masculine traits that bring destruction also defeat tyranny. The traits that foster greed also build economies. The traits that drive men to take foolish risks also drive men to take heroic risks. The answer to toxic masculinity isn't less masculinity. It's better masculinity. And we know what that looks like. It's a young man opening the door for a girl on their first date. It's a father working long hours to provide for his family. It's a soldier risking his life to defend his country. The growing problem in today's society isn't that men are too masculine. It's that they're not masculine enough. When men embrace their masculinity in a way that is healthy and productive, they are leaders, warriors, and heroes. When they deny their masculinity, they run away from responsibilities, leaving destruction and despair in their wake. The consequences can be seen everywhere. 1 in 4 fathers now lives apart from his children. And children who grow up without a dad are generally more depressed than their peers who have a mother and a father. They are at far greater risk for incarceration, teen pregnancy, and poverty. 71% of high school dropouts are fatherless. Of all the rocks upon which we build our lives, family is the most important. And we are called to recognize and honor how critical every father is to that foundation. That was said by then Senator Barack Obama in 2008. If we are honest with ourselves, he went on, we'll admit that too many fathers are missing from too many lives and too many homes. As much as we try to deny the need for real masculine strength in society, there's no denying its necessity. Healthy families and strong communities depend on the leadership and bravery of good men. Yet, the current trend is to feminize young men in the hopes of achieving some utopian notion of equality and peace. And it starts at the earliest ages. In the school classroom, boys are invariably the problem. On the playground, aggressive games like dodgeball have long been banished. We tell young men that their intrinsic desire to compete is wrong. Everybody gets a trophy. Don't run up the score. This anti-male tilt continues on through higher education and into the workplace. It has created millions of tentative men, unhappy women, and confused boys and girls. Here's a secret that every woman knows. Women want real men. Men they can count on and, yes, look up to. No amount of feminist theory will change that. I don't know any woman at any age who is attracted to a passive man who looks to her to be his provider, protector, and leader. Every woman I know wants a strong, responsible man. That's not a consequence of a social construct or cultural pressure. It's innate. The devaluation of masculinity won't end well because feminine passive men don't stop evil. Passive men don't defend, protect, or provide. Passive men don't lead. Passive men don't do the things we have always needed men to do for society to thrive. In his book, The Abolition of Man, English social philosopher C.S. Lewis writes about this problem. He describes the tension between cerebral man and visceral man. By his intellect, Lewis explains, man is mere spirit, and by his appetite, mere animal. We need both. Take away one, and you're left with a man who's either weak or wicked. And in a world of wickedness, weak men are nothing more than enablers of wicked men. Rape, murder, war. They all have two things in common. Bad men who do the raping, murdering, and warring, and weak men who won't stop them. We need good men who will. It's not masculinity that's toxic. It's the lack of it. I'm Allie Stuckey for Prager University.
3 white men walk into a bar. You're a racist. Is that a joke? In today's hypersensitive world, it's hard to know what's funny anymore. And as someone who makes his living as a comedian, that's a big problem. Ask Jerry Seinfeld. He's announced he won't play college campuses. He doesn't want to deal with all the political correctness. And he's not exactly edgy. Comedy is important. Why? Because it's a pressure valve that allows us to discuss uncomfortable truths in a friendly way. Laughs are better than punches. But identity politics is killing the gag. How many times have you heard someone say something like this? You're not black, so you don't know what it's like to be me. You're a man, so you can't have an opinion about any issues affecting women. As a left-handed pansexual leprechaun, only I really know about elevator safety. Comedy only works when we agree on certain realities. Take this joke. Why do you always go fishing with at least 2 Baptists? Because if you only take one, he'll drink all your beer. The reason this gets a laugh is because most of us recognize that many religious people are a little more religious around other religious people. That hypocrisy is funny because everyone can relate to it on some level. We're all a little hypocritical now and then. The problem is that today, fewer and fewer people seem to agree on the basics. You know, shared assumptions. I recently did a joke on stage. People keep comparing Donald Trump to Adolf Hitler. He's nothing like Hitler. Hitler would have never let CNN talk like that. Anderson Cooper wouldn't have made it through the night of the long knives. There are people that don't understand that joke. And the reason is that joke requires us all to agree, and stick with me here, that Hitler was a bad, bad man. And that the night of long knives was a bad, bad thing. And that President Trump, whether you like him or not, isn't anything like that bad, bad man who did that bad, bad thing. And I wouldn't want him to be. But since we now live in a world where some stupid people like Hitler and some other stupid people think Trump is Hitler, well, we just can't agree that this obviously absurd joke is funny. We can't even agree that it's obviously absurd. How about this? Why did the chicken cross the road? Why is the rooster being paid more for crossing the same road? Is that absurd enough for you? During the run-up to the release of the movie Black Panther, all the marketing push was about how, finally, there was a black movie made by black people, with black people for black people. I found this to be fairly hilarious, so I simply took any statement about the film and responded as a white person that actually had that insane way of viewing the world. I just saw the trailer for Black Panther. Ugh, no white people. Looks terrible. Hard pass. Who am I supposed to relate to? No one's white. Not one, But two prominent black actors, Don Cheadle and Jeffrey Wright, started tweeting me about how it's time black people had a movie and how I should be more sensitive to their situation. Keep in mind, both of these black actors are already rich and famous. I figured this was such an obviously satirical take on identity politics that no one could miss the joke. Nope. I was releasing a little social stress through satire. That's what comedians are supposed to do. Releasing social stress used to be the special task of late night comedy, the place that everyone could meet at the end of a long day. But that's dead too. Nobody takes themselves more seriously than these former comedians. Seems like Jimmy Kimmel cries more often than he tells jokes these days. And Stephen Colbert is just Rachel Maddow with punchlines. As if we weren't already divided enough, they're only telling jokes for half the country now. There's no shortage of things to laugh about. We just need to find them together. And if we don't, we'll explode. And that's not a joke. I'm Owen Benjamin for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video. To help keep PragerU videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.
Ah, Sweden, what a great nation, where no one is poor and everybody's healthy. We've solved the problems, we've squared the circle. We prove that big government can result in great prosperity. No, that's dead wrong. You know the old joke, how do you end up with a small fortune? You start with a large fortune, and then you waste a lot of it. And that's the Swedish experience. We got rich once upon a time because of free markets. Between 1850 and 1950, Sweden's income per capita increased eightfold, and taxes were lower than 20% of GDP, lower than in other Western countries, and much like the United States. Only then, when we were already rich, did we start to build a large welfare state. And that hurt us. In 1974, Sweden was 50% richer than the average OECD country. 20 years later, that gap had halved, and it ended in a terrible economic crisis. Sweden fell from being the fourth richest country to the 13th. Despite its reputation for being a workers' paradise, real wages were stagnant for 20 years. Then we reintroduced free market reforms. And then, in the next 20 years, real wages increased 70%. So Sweden is much like other places. Free markets worked here. It made us rich. But then big government almost ruined us. But reform since then got us back on track. Sweden, huh? A bunch of socialists. Like Cuba without the sun. We hate it. Or well, we love it if we're socialists. But both the left and the right are dead wrong. If you think my country, Sweden, is socialist, you don't understand the meaning of socialism. Socialism means having the government owning the means of production, like in Cuba, Venezuela, or North Korea. But Swedish Social Democrats understood early on that they needed free enterprise to make Sweden prosper. And in fact, they even gave special privileges to big businesses. Instead, they tried to socialize consumption with tax and spend policies. But since the 1990s, public spending in Sweden as a percentage of GDP has declined by almost a third, and is now lower than in countries like Belgium and France, Finland and Denmark. And we combine this model with relatively free markets, with free trade, with pension reform, school vouchers, and no taxes on property, wealth and inheritance. A recent index of economic freedom even showed that Sweden is a more economically free market than the United States. So it's not Cuba without the sun. It's more like the United States without the sun, except in summertime, when the sun never sets in northern Sweden. The information sector is growing relentlessly, especially its profits. But its share of US GDP has actually declined over the last 10 years. You'd be forgiven for thinking that this sector doesn't contribute anything to wealth and to productivity. But you would be dead wrong. A cynic, Oscar Wilde, wrote, "is a man who knows the price of everything but the value of nothing." And the same thing can be said for our GDP measurements. Because we know exactly how much we pay for stuff, but it's very difficult to estimate the value we get from things that we get for free or almost for free. So when we replace physical goods we paid for, maps, cameras, calculators, encyclopedias, with digital versions that are almost free, it looks like GDP and productivity declined. But for the consumer, it means getting much better quality, greater variety, almost for free. It's possible to measure this consumer surplus by asking people how much they would demand to go without a particular service for a month. And then it turns out that we value search engines at almost $18,000, email services at more than $8,000, and digital maps at $3,600. If we were to include just those three services in our GDP, then GDP per capita just increased by 50%. And hey, what about these Dead Wrong clips? You get them for free. How much would you demand to go without them for a month? Huh? I want to live in the city, and you want to live in the city. But there are too few apartments, so we need rent control to make it affordable for everyone, not just the richest. Dead wrong. If price controls were the solution to scarcity, Venezuela would now be one giant breadbasket rather than the long bread line it really is. Price controls, artificially reducing the price of something, reduces supply and creates scarcity. In San Francisco right now, it seems like all the leading candidates for mayor and the voters want to solve the housing crisis by extending rent control rather than just allowing people to build more. But almost half of all the rental apartments in San Francisco are already regulated. What did that lead to? Well, not to what was intended. It resulted in landlords not wanting to own old rental property anymore. Instead, they began to redevelop them, and often they converted them into condos. As a result of rent control, the supply of rental housing in San Francisco declined by 15%. And paradoxically, because of this shortage, rents were actually pushed up by more than 5% citywide. And on the informal market, you have to pay even more. So if you think the rent is too damn high now, just wait till you see what you have to pay after rent control.